So let's talk about this. Joining us now, Republican Congressman Jim Jordan from Ohio, who was in the hearing today, and our friend Vince Reinhart, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and of course, former director of monetary affairs at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. Hello, gentlemen. Mr. Jordan, thank you for coming on the show. I want to ask you this. There's some parts of this that burned me up today. Here's Mr. Bernanke saying 3.5% to 4% growth this year and next year. He's saying it's a self-sustaining expansion. But when you and Jeb Hensarling and others asked him about cutting spending, he said, not in the short run, only in the medium term. Now, if not in the short run, with the sustaining expansion, when are we going to cut spending? You know, it's like everybody in Washington has an excuse not to cut spending. This guy just said the economy is strong, the private sector has the ball, and yet he's telling you, don't do it in the short run. That lets you all off the hook. That lets the White House off the hook. What is up with this? What is up with this?
If not now, when? I mean, if not when, you got a $13 trillion debt, you got a $1.4 trillion deficit. Within a couple years, we'll be paying $1 billion a day just to sustain, just to serve the, the interest, just to service the debt. So if not now, when? On one hand, he says it's unsustainable, which is true. I mean, everyone in America understands the budget path we're on is unsustainable. Everyone except the Democrat Congress and this administration. So on one hand, he says it's unsustainable, but then he doesn't want us to cut spending. So I offered, in the committee, I said, look, we introduced a balanced budget. The conservative members of the House introduced a balanced budget 2 weeks ago. We'd like for you to take a look at it because we think it makes sense. It doesn't raise taxes. It does the right things. We think it is that sustainable path that will begin to turn this ship around, put us on a path where we can have sustained growth and move in the right direction. So I think that was the key point. The other thing I would point out that I think is important, in the start of his testimony, he did talk about a fairly optimistic near-term and even into next year economy. 3.5% growth and even a little higher he expects next year. But what he doesn't really seem to take into account, in my opinion, is the tax increases that are going to kick in next year. Top marginal rates are going to go up. Dividends are going to go up. The capital gains tax rates. Art Laffer has a great column earlier this week in the Journal where he talks about the simple truth in economics, that government policies influence people's behavior. And people will defer income or take income depending on what is coming and what kind of government policies are in place. We could be having people take some income and do some things this year that are helping with that 3.5% growth, but next year may not be there because of the big tax increases that are going to kick in. So I think that's a key point we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about where this economy is headed.
No, you're dead right. And you did it while I was anchoring this morning. We had Art Laffer on the program Monday evening to talk about this. Now, let me ask you, before I go to my pal Vince Reinhart, Jordan, Bernanke didn't really answer you about the scheduled tax hikes. He just sort of didn't go there. What's up with that?
Well, I think that's in sort of deference to the folks who are in control of Congress right now and the administration that's in in the White House. They don't particularly like that kind of talk, even though any economist will tell you that makes sense to that in fact is the case. So I think he dodged it. I should have probably pressed him a little harder, but I also wanted to talk about our budget and this sustainable spending.
Yeah, you were much too nice to him. You were much too nice to him, for heaven's sakes. Now, Vince Reinhart, I want to go to you with this. If the economy is growing at 3.5% to 4%, if it's a self-sustaining expansion, as Bernanke described today, that was his word, if the private sector is running with the ball, the Beige Book came out pretty strong today. Why didn't he come out and say now is the time to go to work on this outrageous budget deficit and debt creation? Because, Vince, here's how a Fed chairman could operate. There's a $200 billion phony stimulus bill for even more spending on the table. That stuff will be built into the current services baseline for the next 100 years, Vince. If Bernanke had been tougher, not this medium-term stuff, but right now, he could stop this phony bill and save the taxpayers $1 trillion, Vince. So why is Bernanke so wussy? Why is he so accommodationist to this free spending Congress?
I am shocked as well, Larry, that the chairman of the Federal Reserve is a Washington fixture. The fact is...
Well, Greenspan used to, in his heyday, Greenspan used to give him hell. And Paul Volcker used to give him hell. Now, come on. Fed chairmen have an obligation because it affects the economy, Vince.
They try not to be specific about specific pieces of legislation. And the plain fact is that the Fed had a near-death experience in terms of its powers, and Chairman Bernanke was trying to be the least confrontational as possible. And there's one word that he repeated the most that you haven't mentioned yet, and that's modest. That growth, that handoff from the public to the private sector is still going to be consistent with only modest expansion in spending, one in which the unemployment rate stays in its current neighborhood.
Yeah,
and a neighborhood at 9 3/4% isn't too encouraging.
All right, Vince Reinhart, I'm going to call you on that, so let me get this right. Spending hundreds of billions of dollars is going to take care of that problem? You see, this is my problem with Bernanke.
No.
What you're describing, because he had a near-death experience with this GAO audit, is that, in fact, this Democratic Congress has politicized the Fed. That's what I heard today, Vince. Now, come on, what's your take on that? You've just basically acknowledged that.
Yes, of course. That's not a surprise.
Well, I'm surprised. I'm shocked.
When the legislation is over, there are probably going to be 3 presidential appointments, Senate confirmation involving the Fed. The Fed is going to be expected to be a significant player re-regulating the financial system. The Fed is politicized.
Mr. Jordan, Bernanke outlined, I forget who asked him, but what the criteria are for a good budget fiscal situation. He said, excluding interest on the debt, the so-called primary deficit should be in balance. Mr. Jordan, in your lifetime or my lifetime or Vince Reinhart's lifetime, do you expect that ever to occur?
I do, because I trust the American people. Look at what we've seen politically in this country. The people speaking out, and they're making a difference in who's going to be elected. Who's getting elected right now? What happened yesterday in the primaries? So I do expect, the people always get it much sooner than the people here in Washington, than the politicians here in Washington. So I do expect we can get this under control, but it's the people who drive this, and that's why I'm confident we can. They understand what seems, politicians here in town don't get, that our GDP, deficit to GDP ratio, our debt to GDP ratio, we're looking like Greece, we're looking like Italy. They understand the gravity of the situation. They're going to put the pressure on the elected officials, pressure on the politicians, and I think we can move it in the right direction. We introduced a balanced budget. We got 111 votes for it last year. We're moving in the right direction on a budget that actually does get to balance and puts us on that sustainable path.
Well, do you agree with Vince Reinhart that Bernanke has been politicized, that this Congress has intimidated and cowed him into essentially doing their bidding without Bernanke raising a whimper? I mean, he should have come out today and said no more stimulus is necessary. He should have said that. That's what the American people want to hear. Financial markets would have liked to hear that, and he didn't. Is he been intimidated by this Democratic Congress, Jim?
This whole town is politicized, but I do think you're right. He should have come out today and said we need to begin to cut spending now.
Right.
We need to begin to turn this ship around now. The American people demand it, and frankly, we don't want to be in the situation Greece is in and what Europe is in. And as I pointed out, our deficit to GDP, our debt to GDP ratios are looking very similar to those. So he should have been clear about that and said, instead he talked about this unsustainable, talked in broad terms. He should have been more specific, said we need to cut spending. That's why I said, take a look at our budget. It does the right things.
Vince Reinhart, Bernanke said he didn't understand why the gold price has been skyrocketing. Maybe he could make the connection that Jim Jordan is making. Maybe he could say it's because of out-of-control spending and out-of-control deficits and out-of-control debt, Vince Reinhart. Maybe you should write him an email and say, try that on for size. That's why the gold price is going up.
So he couldn't understand it because the normal thing you point to, inflation expectations, aren't a problem. They're well anchored. But I do think you're right. The fact that gold prices are going a different way than other commodity prices means that the U.S.'s role as the reserve currency is beginning to be questioned.
All right. Very good. Thank you very much, Congressman Jim Jordan. We appreciate it. Vince Reinhart, as always, we